Hey everyone, today we're opening the cupboard on a 1960s school morning, when a bright cereal box stood beside the newspaper, a chrome toaster clicked near the Formica counter, and a glass of milk waited under the refrigerator's steady hum. Breakfast could look wonderfully simple from a child's chair. Pour, splash, stir and eat before the bus appeared. Yet that ordinary bowl sat at the center of a changing American kitchen, where older cooked breakfasts were meeting television mascots, supermarket abundance, and the growing promise that a cardboard box could rescue a family from the clock. If these forgotten foods, grocery habits, kitchen rules and family traditions bring back a familiar room, please like the video and subscribe to Forgotten American Home. Which breakfast on this list do you remember most clearly? And what did your family serve when everyone was already running late? The 25 breakfasts in this story are not meant to suggest that every child ate the same way. Morning tables differed by region, income, family background, farm schedules, parents' work, and what the local grocery store carried. Some children received eggs and biscuits, others grabbed toast, some left home without breakfast at all. But the meals on this list appeared often enough in family kitchens, advertisements, recipe booklets, and childhood memories to help explain how the American school morning was changing. The first breakfast was the plain bowl of cornflakes and milk, a meal so familiar that it could nearly disappear into the wallpaper. The box was opened by lifting two cardboard flaps, although one was usually torn, and the inner wax paper bag rarely folded as neatly as the package seemed to expect. Pale flakes rattled into a ceramic bowl, followed by cold milk from a bottle or carton, depending on the household and the region. A child might add sugar from the table bowl, sometimes one careful spoonful and sometimes a small geological deposit. The first bites were crisp, the last ones soft, and the milk at the bottom carried a faint sweetness that made drinking from the bowl tempting when no adult was looking. Cornflakes suited the weekday because they required no skillet, no mixing bowl, and almost no waiting. Someone still bought the cereal, checked the milk set out. The dishes wiped up the spill and returned the open box to the shelf. But the visible work had been reduced to less than a minute. That speed mattered. In many homes, the kitchen clock governed the room more firmly than any recipe did. A parent might be packing lunches, finding lunch money, signing a school paper, listening for the weather report, and reminding a child that one shoe did not count as being dressed. Against that commotion, cold cereal was remarkably cooperative. It could be served to one child at 6:30 and another 20 minutes later without reheating anything. Older children could pour it themselves, although the milk carton sometimes arrived at the table with the confidence of a pitcher and the accuracy of a garden hose. Plain cereal also allowed each family to adjust the bowl. Banana slices, raisins, berries in season, or a spoonful of sugar could make it more filling or more acceptable. The breakfast was inexpensive compared with a daily plate of meat and eggs, but it was not effortless in the larger sense. Its convenience depended on the supermarket trip, reliable refrigeration, clean bowls, and the quiet morning labor that made simplicity possible. One shelf away waited the breakfast children were far more likely to request by name sweetened cereal in a box guarded by a cartoon mascot. By the 1960s, the cereal aisle had become a small theater of rabbits, tigers, birds, sailors, leprechauns, and other determined characters who seemed deeply concerned about what children ate before arithmetic. The box might promise fruit flavor, chocolate flavor, marshmallow pieces a prize, a cutout game, or something to send away for after collecting enough box tops. Television made these characters feel less like package decorations and more like familiar visitors who arrived between cartoons. A child could recognize the commercial, repeat the slogan, and begin negotiating in the supermarket before the cart had fully entered the aisle. Parents, meanwhile, had to compare price, sugar, package size, and the likelihood that enthusiasm would survive more than 2 bowls. The cereal might be colourful and exciting on Monday, then sit untouched by Thursday, after the premium had been removed from the box. In the bowl, sweetened cereal changed the entire mood of breakfast. The pieces might be brightly coloured puffs, frosted flakes, chocolate rounds, or oat shapes, mixed with small marshmallow pieces. Milk became sweeter, and sometimes changed colour, which felt to a child like a second course, included at no extra charge. Yet the real product was larger than the food. The front of the box offered a character, the back offered entertainment, and the television commercial offered a story in which breakfast was an adventure rather than a deadline. That marketing did not erase the older bowl of cornflakes. Both often stood in the same cupboard, one chosen by the parent and the other defended by the child. Together they captured the school morning bargain of the decade adults wanted speed and predictability. Children wanted sweetness and spectacle, and the cereal companies were delighted to provide a box that claimed to satisfy everyone. Before long, even the plain bowl would receive an upgrade as a kitchen knife began cutting a banana into soft yellow coins above the milk. A banana rarely reached the cereal bowl in one piece. It arrived in soft yellow coins cut directly over the milk with a small kitchen knife, while the cereal beneath them was still crisp. Some slices floated near the surface. Others slipped between the flakes and disappeared until the spoon found them later. On a 1960s school morning, this small addition could make a plain bowl feel more complete without requiring another pan, another burner, or another 10 minutes. The banana waited in a fruit bowl on the counter, sometimes green at the stem, sometimes already marked with brown freckles that meant it had to be used today. A parent peeled it halfway, held it above the bowl and sliced quickly, while listening for the school bus, the weather report, or the familiar complaint that someone could not find a notebook. The breakfast still looked simple, yet the soft fruit, cold milk, and dry cereal represented a carefully balanced solution to the morning problem. Make it filling, make it affordable, and make sure the child finished before the flakes surrendered completely. Bananas worked especially well because they demanded almost no preparation and produced very little resistance at the table. They were sweet without needing to come from the sugar bowl, soft enough for younger children, and substantial enough to make a small serving of cereal seem larger. In some households, the banana was divided between 2 or 3 bowls, each child receiving only a few slices, because groceries had to last until the next shopping trip. A parent might cut the fruit so thinly that every spoonful appeared to contain some achievement that belonged less to cooking than to household mathematics. Other children were allowed to slice their own banana, which could result in pieces ranging from transparent circles to sections better described as building materials. The knife was set down beside the bowl, the peel folded inward to contain the strings, and the breakfast continued. No recipe card was required, no advertisement needed to explain the method. It was simply one of those practical combinations that families repeated until it became part of the room. The texture changed from bite to bite. At first, the cereal cracked beneath the spoon while the banana remained cool and firm. A few minutes later, the flakes softened, the banana grew slippery, and the milk took on a faint fruit sweetness. Children who disliked plain cereal might tolerate it once banana slices appeared. Children who disliked bananas became highly skilled at pushing them against the side of the bowl while claiming they were still eating. The last spoonful was often the strangest warmish milk, 2 soggy flakes and 1 banana slice that had been hiding at the bottom since the beginning. That final piece could feel like a reward or a personal betrayal. The result depended entirely on the child. What adults saw as sensible nutrition and good use of fruit, children experienced as a sequence of textures that changed faster than the morning clock. Still, the bowl was usually emptied more readily than a plate requiring a fork and knife, and that mattered when coats, lunch boxes, homework folders, and permission slips were all competing for attention. The banana bowl also belonged to a period when supermarkets were making fresh produce more consistently visible to many American families, although price, season, region, and access still shaped what appeared on the counter. In rural communities, small towns, city neighborhoods, and households without easy transportation, fruit choices could be narrower or less predictable. Some families bought bananas every week. Others treated them as something to use quickly before they spoiled. The fruit bowl itself became a quiet schedule. Green bananas meant there was time. Yellow bananas meant breakfast. Brown bananas meant someone would soon suggest banana bread provided there was enough flour, enough patience, and a recipe card that could still be read beneath the stains. For the school morning bowl, however, the ideal banana was just firm enough to slice cleanly and ripe enough to sweeten plain cereal. It required no refrigeration before peeling, no can opener, and no thawing. In a kitchen built around speed, those were considerable virtues. Parents could also use the banana to negotiate between what children wanted and what adults considered a proper breakfast. A child might have chosen the sweetest cereal in the cupboard, while the parent added fruit as though restoring order to the arrangement. Another child might receive plain cornflakes because that was what the family bought with banana slices, supplying the sweetness that advertising placed inside more expensive boxes. The same combination could therefore represent abundance in one kitchen and careful budgeting in another. It might be served in a bright modern suburb, a farmhouse before chores and apartment, where several children shared a small table, or a home in which breakfast was eaten in shifts around different work schedules. The bowl did not belong to only one kind of American family. Its ingredients were ordinary enough to cross many household lines, even though not every child encountered them in the same way. What united the memory was the action peel, slice, pour, stir, hurry. Sometimes the banana never reached the bowl at all. A child running late might carry it toward the door, still fastening a coat, or trying to hold a lunchbox at the same time. The peel made the fruit portable, but not necessarily convenient. It bruised inside a school bag, attracted comments if forgotten in a desk, and became difficult to manage on a crowded bus. At the table, at least, the banana had a defined role. It made cereal feel less empty, and gave the spoon something to find beneath the milk. It was one of the smallest improvements in the 1960s breakfast routine, but small improvements were often what held the morning together. The next breakfast required more patience. Instead of a cardboard box and a kitchen knife, it began with a saucepan, a wooden spoon, and a pale surface that could develop lumps the moment the cook looked away. The saucepan began its work before most children were fully awake. Water or milk warmed over the burner while a parent reached for a cardboard cylinder of oats or a box of farina from the pantry shelf. On cold 1960s mornings, when the kitchen window carried a faint film of steam and the floor felt chilly beneath stocking feet, a hot cereal bowl offered something that cold flakes could not. It held warmth long enough to slow the morning down even when the clock insisted otherwise. Oatmeal entered the pan in pale dry flakes while farina fell in a finer stream that demanded steady stirring. Both breakfasts looked modest. Both could feed several children without using eggs, bacon, or much refrigerator space. And both had one important weakness: the cook could not simply pour and walk away. Ignore the saucepan for half a minute, and breakfast might stick to the bottom, boil over the rim, or form lumps with the determination of small household gravel. Oatmeal usually announced itself by smell before it reached the table. The scent was mild, warm, and slightly nutty, especially when the oats simmered long enough to thicken properly. A wooden spoon scraped the bottom of the pan while the surface made slow bubbles that burst and disappeared. In some homes, the cereal was cooked with water and softened afterward with milk. In others, milk went into the pan from the beginning, producing a richer bowl and a greater chance that the burner would require attention. The finished oatmeal was spooned into thick ceramic bowls and then adjusted according to family habit. Brown sugar might be placed in the centre, where it melted into a dark syrup beneath the steam. Raisins could be stirred through the bowl, swelling slightly as they warmed. A pat of butter disappeared into the surface, leaving a glossy trail that children sometimes followed with the spoon before eating anything else. The toppings carried their own small negotiations. A parent might sprinkle brown sugar carefully, believing sweetness should improve the oatmeal rather than bury it. A child might wait until the sugar bowl was unguarded and construct something closer to a dessert. Raisins divided the table more reliably. Some children liked finding the soft dark pieces among the oats. Others treated every raisin as an obstacle, requiring removal and placement along the rim of the bowl. Cinnamon chopped apple, canned peaches, or a little syrup might appear in different households, but many school mornings depended on whatever was already within reach. Hot cereal was useful because it could stretch. More water made more servings. An extra handful of oats could help feed an unexpected cousin, a hungry older child, or a father who'd come into the kitchen before leaving for work. The bowl was inexpensive, but the morning labour behind it was measured in stirring, watching, serving, and washing the pan before the starch dried into something resembling plaster. Farina offered a smoother breakfast, at least when everything went according to plan. Sold under familiar brand names or as a general hot wheat cereal, it entered the saucepan as tiny grains and thickened quickly. The cook had to pour with one hand and stir with the other, a coordination test that old advertisements rarely emphasized. Added too quickly, the cereal formed pale lumps that survived every attempt at persuasion. Added slowly, it became soft and nearly creamy, with a surface smooth enough to hold a small pool of melted butter. Children often knew it by a brand name such as cream of wheat, although similar wheat cereals appeared in many kitchens. Its flavour was mild enough to accept almost anything the family preferred: sugar, milk, cinnamon, raisins, fruit, or sometimes salt and butter without sweetness. The spoon left a track across the bowl that closed gradually behind it, and the cereal remained hot long after a child had declared that the school bus was probably coming. Cooling the bowl became part of the meal. A child might blow across each spoonful, stir repeatedly, or add a little cold milk around the edge. Someone in a hurry spread the cereal thinly against the sides of the bowl, increasing the surface area without knowing there was a scientific explanation for the technique. Younger children sometimes received a saucer beneath the bowl to catch drips and protect the table. The first spoonful was often too hot. The second was approached with suspicion. By the time the temperature became perfect, the cereal had thickened further, and the clock had advanced several dangerous minutes. Hot cereal did not cooperate with lateness as easily as cornflakes did. It expected the child to sit, hold the spoon, and remain in one place. A coat could not be pulled on gracefully while eating it, and carrying the bowl toward the door was not an experiment many parents permitted twice. For families watching the grocery budget, oats and farina earned their pantry space, because they were dry, dependable, and easy to portion. They did not spoil quickly when stored properly, and one container could provide several mornings of breakfast. Their usefulness crossed regional and economic lines, although preparation and toppings varied widely. Some children encountered oatmeal only during winter, others ate it throughout the year. In one home it was a plain weekday necessity, in another it came with cream fruit or generous brown sugar. Farm families, city apartment households, suburban kitchens, and families living far from large supermarkets could all make use of a cereal that waited quietly on the shelf. Yet the same bowl could carry very different meanings. For one child it was comfort before walking into cold weather. For another it was the breakfast that had to be finished even after it became cool, dense and increasingly unwilling to leave the spoon. By the end of the decade, faster breakfast products were making stronger promises, but the saucepan did not disappear. Oatmeal and farina remained tied to mornings when warmth mattered, when the pantry needed to stretch, or when a parent believed a cooked breakfast sent a child into the day more properly than a handful of something sweet from a box. The memory often survives in small details: the brown sugar melting into a crater, the raisins gathering at the bottom, the skin that sometimes formed on cooling cereal, and the spoon standing almost upright when breakfast had been neglected too long. Hot cereal asked for patience from everyone involved. The cook had to watch it, the child had to wait for it, and the saucepan had to be soaked afterward. The next breakfast demanded less patience. It began when bread dropped into a toaster, the lever pressed down, and butter and jelly waited for the sudden metal click. The toaster lever went down with a firm metallic click, and for the next minute the whole school morning seemed to depend on 2 slices of bread. In many 1960s, kitchen's toast was the breakfast that appeared when there was no time for a saucepan, no patience for a skillet, and no argument left to settle. The bread might come from a soft supermarket loaf, a bakery wrapper folded shut with a paper tab, or slices cut from whatever remained in the bread box. Inside the toaster, the coils glowed orange while a child watched closely enough to believe attention could make the bread rise faster. Then came the sudden pop, sometimes sending one slice higher than the other, and occasionally frightening anyone standing nearby. The toast landed on a small plate or in a metal rack that allowed steam to escape, although many families simply placed it directly on the table. Butter waited beside a jar of jelly, and the rule was simple: spread quickly while the surface was still hot. Buttered toast with jelly was modest enough for an ordinary weekday, and flexible enough to satisfy several different tastes without cooking several different meals. One child wanted grape jelly spread from corner to corner, another preferred strawberry preserves with visible pieces of fruit. A third might accept only butter provided it melted completely and left no pale lumps behind. The knife moved from the butter dish to the jelly jar, sometimes carrying crumbs with it despite repeated instructions not to do exactly that. Warm toast softened the butter immediately, but jelly behaved according to temperature. A jar taken from the refrigerator could pull at the bread and tear the centre, leaving a sticky opening that had to be covered with more jelly. A jar kept in the cupboard spread more easily, but invited its own household debate about storage. Whatever the family practice, the finished slice had to be eaten quickly. Wait too long and the toast became cold, the butter disappeared into the bread, and the jelly formed a shining layer that threatened every sleeve on the way to school. Toast solved several practical problems at once. It used bread already purchased for sandwiches, and supper required very little fuel or preparation, and could be made 1 or 2 slices at a time as children entered the kitchen in shifts. A parent preparing lunches could press the toaster lever with one hand while folding wax paper around a sandwich with the other. An older child could make breakfast independently, although judging the browning control required experience. Set too low, the toaster produced warm bread wearing only the suggestion of colour. Set too high, it released smoke, a burnt smell, and a slice that had to be scraped over the sink with a butter knife. That scraping sound was part of many hurried mornings, followed by the optimistic claim that the toast was still perfectly good. Dark edges were removed, the black crumbs were brushed away, and jelly was applied with enough confidence to conceal the evidence. The second toast breakfast used even fewer expensive ingredients but felt more like a treat. Cinnamon sugar toast began with the same bread and butter, then changed direction with a small jar cup or reused shaker filled with sugar and cinnamon. Some families mixed the two in advance so it could be sprinkled evenly. Others added them separately, producing one bite that tasted mostly of cinnamon and another that could have sweetened an entire cup of coffee. The butter acted as glue, holding the mixture to the bread until the slice was lifted. In some kitchens, the toast came straight from the pop-up toaster and received its cinnamon sugar at the table. In others, buttered bread was placed beneath the broiler until the topping melted and the edges turned crisp. The broiler method created a darker, slightly caramelized surface, but it also required close supervision. Cinnamon toast could move from pale to burned during the brief moment someone went to find a missing homework folder. Children remembered cinnamon toast because its smell filled the room more completely than its ingredients suggested. Warm butter, toasted bread sugar, and cinnamon created the impression that something more elaborate had been baked, even when breakfast had taken only a few minutes. The topping collected in rough golden patches and loose crystals remained on the plate after the bread was gone. A careful child pressed a fingertip into them. A less careful child tilted the plate directly toward the mouth, usually after checking whether an adult was watching. The toast could be cut into rectangles, triangles, or narrow strips depending on family habit and how much time remained. Triangles somehow made the same slice look more generous. Strips were easier for younger children to handle. Whole slices were fastest, though they left a crescent of sugar near the mouth and a trail of crumbs across school clothes that had supposedly been cleaned 5 minutes earlier. These two breakfasts also showed how families use small changes to keep familiar food from becoming tiresome. Bread and butter were pantry and refrigerator standards in many households. Jelly made them brighter. Cinnamon sugar made them feel special. Neither breakfast required a new shopping list, and both could stretch when the grocery budget was tight. One slice might be enough for a younger child. Two could hold an older student until lunchtime, especially with milk juice, or fruit beside them. Yet toast also revealed the limits of convenience. Someone had to remember to buy bread. Someone had to rescue the butter from the refrigerator early enough to spread. Someone had to wipe jelly from the table, shake crumbs from the placemat, and remove the blackened slice that had fallen into the toaster tray. The appliance promised speed, not freedom from cleanup. By the time the school bus appeared at the corner, the plate usually held only a few crumbs and a streak of jelly left behind by the knife. Toast had done its job without ceremony. It had warmed the kitchen, quieted hunger, and allowed breakfast to happen while the rest of the household continued moving. The next slice would be heavier and more determined. Instead of jelly or cinnamon sugar, it would carry a thick layer of peanut butter that softened in the heat, clung to the roof of the mouth, and made a glass of milk feel less like an option than a necessary piece of equipment. Peanut butter changed the weight of a slice of toast before it changed anything else. The bread rose from the toaster light and crisp, but once the knife began pushing a thick tan layer from edge to edge, breakfast became something sturdier. On a 1960s school morning, peanut butter toast belonged to the category of meals that could be made quickly, yet seemed capable of carrying a child farther than plain bread and jelly. The heat softened the spread, releasing a roasted smell and making the surface shine. If the peanut butter was especially thick, it pulled at the toast and gathered into ridges behind the knife. If the bread was very fresh, the center sometimes tore before the spreading was finished. A parent might repair the opening with another small spoonful, creating a breakfast heavier in the middle than originally intended. Beside the plate stood a glass of milk because everyone understood the practical difficulty ahead. Peanut butter could cling to the roof of the mouth with astonishing determination, and toast added just enough dryness to make the first swallow an event requiring preparation. The jar usually waited in the cupboard ready without refrigeration, and useful far beyond breakfast. It could fill school sandwiches, hold crackers together after school, or add substance to celery sticks when a parent was feeling ambitious. At breakfast, its greatest advantage was speed. There was no pan to heat, no egg to crack, and no bowl to scrub. A child old enough to operate the toaster could often prepare the meal alone, although the jar might return to the shelf with crumbs around the rim and a knife left standing upright inside it. Smooth peanut butter spread more easily across crisp bread. Crunchy peanut butter added small pieces that made each bite more interesting and occasionally more difficult to chew, while someone was asking whether the homework had been packed. Some households bought a familiar national brand. Others chose a supermarket label, or whatever happened to be on sale. In families where every grocery item had to justify its space, peanut butter performed admirably. It was compact filling, widely useful, and unlikely to be rejected by every child at the table at the same time. The milk completed the breakfast not only because the two foods were commonly paired, but because the combination worked mechanically. One bite of warm toast could leave the mouth dry and sticky, followed by a cold swallow that cleared the way for the next. Children learned to alternate without being told bite, chew, drink, repeat. A glass filled too generously became dangerous when carried beside a schoolbook or lunchbox. A glass filled too lightly had to be rationed until the final crust. Some children dipped the edge of the toast into the milk, a practice adults viewed with varying degrees of tolerance. Others folded the slice in half to keep the peanut butter away from fingers, creating a makeshift sandwich that could be eaten while standing. The folded method was practical, although pressure forced the softened spread toward the open sides, where it could attach itself to a thumb, a sleeve, or the corner of a permission slip. Peanut butter toast was portable in theory. In practice, it tended to leave evidence. For families watching time and money, the breakfast offered a useful compromise between the cooked meal adults remembered and the packaged convenience foods appearing more boldly in supermarkets. It still required bread to be toasted and something to be spread by hand so it looked like food prepared in the kitchen rather than simply opened. Yet it took only a few minutes and could be adjusted to the child. A thin layer stretched the jar. A thick layer helped satisfy an older student with a long morning ahead. Jelly could be added when sweetness was needed, banana slices when fruit was available, or a dusting of sugar when a child had discovered negotiation as a morning skill. In some households, peanut butter toast was served because eggs and breakfast meat were being saved for another meal. In others, it appeared because the child genuinely preferred it. The same plate could therefore represent thrift, convenience, habit, or affection. Ordinary foods often carried several meanings at once, even when the person eating them was mostly concerned with whether the bus had already passed the corner. Peanut butter itself could provoke small household rules. The knife used in the jar was not supposed to carry butter jelly or toast crumbs back with it. The lid was meant to be replaced tightly. The final spoonful was not to be taken without adding the jar to the grocery list. Children who made their own breakfast were expected to wipe the counter, though the pale smear left beside the toaster often suggested a difference between expectation and performance. The toast also had a narrow window of perfection. Spread the peanut butter immediately and it became warm, soft, and almost glossy. Wait too long and the bread cooled before the first bite. Use too much and the toast bent under the weight. Use too little and the child announced that the breakfast was mostly crust. The meal was simple, but simplicity did not eliminate standards. Every family seemed to know the correct thickness, even when no two families would have agreed on what that thickness was. The memory survives because peanut butter toast fit so naturally into the movement of the morning. It could be eaten at the table while the newspaper rustled at the counter, while a lunch was packed, or near the door while someone searched for gloves. Its smell mixed with coffee, toasted bread, and the faint warmth of the appliance. Its crumbs appeared on dark school clothes with remarkable visibility. Its final bite was often swallowed with the last of the milk just as a coat was being pulled on. The meal asked little from the stove and offered enough substance to feel dependable. Still, some households expected a school breakfast to arrive on a plate with more ceremony. The next morning meal began when an egg touched a hot skillet or settled into a small pan of water, while a slice of toast waited nearby to catch the yolk. The egg announced a different kind of breakfast the moment it touched the skillet. Butter or bacon drippings hissed beneath it. The clear white turned cloudy around the edges, and the yolk settled into the centre like a small yellow clock of its own. In a 1960s kitchen, a fried egg with toast could be simple, but it was never entirely passive. Someone had to warm the pan, crack the shell without dropping a piece into breakfast, and decide whether the yolk should remain soft or cook until no movement remained. At the same time, bread waited inside the toaster, and the clock on the wall continued toward the hour when shoes, coats, lunchboxes, and children all had to leave together. The egg might be ready before the toast might pop while the cook was pouring milk, and one child might suddenly announce that the yolk had been cooked incorrectly. A breakfast of only 2 basic foods could still require the timing of a small railroad station. A fried egg was often served beside toast rather than on top of it. But children quickly discovered that the 2 foods were designed to meet. The corner of the toast could be pressed into the yolk, collecting a warm yellow coating before the rest escaped across the plate. Some families called this dipping. Others simply considered it the obvious reason toast had been placed there. Butter softened the bread while the yolk gave the crisp edges something richer to carry. When the egg was cooked sunny side up, the surface remained bright and delicate. Turned over briefly, it gained a thin white covering while the centre stayed soft. Cooked longer, it became firm enough to cut without any spreading at all, which pleased parents concerned about mess and disappointed children who considered the yolk the entire point. Pepper might be shaken across the top. Salt might be added at the stove or left on the table. The plate looked plain, but the first cut created a moment of suspense. A perfect yolk flowed slowly. An overcooked one sat quietly and accepted its fate. Soft-boiled eggs brought the same ingredients to the table with more ceremony. The egg cooked in its shell, timed carefully enough that the white became firm while the yolk remained warm and loose. In homes that owned egg cups, the finished egg stood upright like a very small guest of honor. The top was tapped with a spoon, or sliced away with a knife exposing the center. Toast could be cut into narrow strips for dipping, although many families used ordinary triangles or whatever shape resulted from the quickest cut. Children learned that the shell had to be opened carefully. Strike too gently and nothing happened. Strike too firmly and pieces of shell fell inward, requiring a patient search with the spoon. The egg cup itself made breakfast feel formal even when a child was wearing one sock, and the kitchen table held yesterday's newspaper. In other homes, the soft-boiled egg was simply placed in a small bowl, peeled partially or broken over toast. The presentation varied, but the appeal remained the same: a warm egg, crisp bread, and a yolk that turned each bite into something more generous. Eggs carried a practical value that families understood without needing a breakfast advertisement to explain it. One egg could give a child a hot meal without requiring a large quantity of meat and toast, made the plate look fuller while using bread already needed for lunches. In households with several children, however, eggs also required arithmetic. A carton could disappear quickly when everyone expected 2. Some mornings offered 1 egg per child, with toast filling the remaining space. Other mornings reserved eggs for adults leaving for physical work, younger children at home, or weekends when breakfast could be cooked in batches. Farm families with their own hens experienced the calculation differently from city and suburban households buying cartons at the grocery store. Income, family size, local prices, and access all shaped how often the egg appeared. The image of every 1960s child beginning each day with a perfect cooked breakfast belongs more comfortably to advertising than to universal memory. Many families served eggs regularly. Others served them when the budget, schedule, and supply allowed. The person at the stove carried the most difficult part of the timing. Eggs did not wait politely once they were ready. Leave one in the skillet while searching for a school paper, and the soft yolk became firm. Remove it too early, and the white near the centre remained translucent enough to cause immediate protest. The cook often prepared several eggs in the same pan, trying to remember which child wanted the yolk soft, and which child insisted that no part of breakfast should move. Toast popped in pairs while plates moved across the counter. A child called from another room. Coffee threatened to boil or sit forgotten. The kitchen clock seemed louder during these mornings because a fried egg could not be folded into wax paper and sent toward the door without consequences. It expected a chair, a fork, and at least a few uninterrupted minutes. Children who ate too slowly heard reminders. Children who ate too quickly sometimes left a bright streak of yolk on the plate and another on a clean shirt. The final piece of toast usually performed clean-up. It moved across the plate, collecting the last yolk butter and crumbs until very little remained. Then the fork was placed down, the milk was finished, and the child was sent toward the coat rack while the skillet cooled on the stove. Egg and toast represented a school breakfast that was warm, recognizable, and still close to older kitchen habits. It required more attention than cereal, and more cooperation than peanut butter toast, but it could make an ordinary weekday feel properly begun. The smell lingered after the plate was cleared, mixing with coffee and toasted bread, while dishes waited beside the sink. On mornings when the household had more time, however, one egg was only the beginning. The skillet grew more crowded, strips of bacon curled at the edges, sausage browned beside scrambled eggs, and breakfast became heavy enough to remain with a child well past the first school bell. Bacon announced itself long before anyone reached the kitchen. Its smell travelled down the hallway, slipped beneath bedroom doors, and made even a sleepy child understand that this was not going to be an ordinary bowl of cereal morning. In a 1960s, kitchen strips of bacon lay across a heavy skillet, shrinking and curling as the fat turned clear around them. Sausage links or patties browned more slowly nearby, while eggs waited in a bowl to be cracked and stirred. This was the breakfast many children imagined when they heard the words "a real breakfast," but it did not appear every weekday in every home. It required meat from the refrigerator, several burners, or careful use of one crowded skillet, and enough time to cook before the school bus arrived. The kitchen grew warm, the window sometimes clouded near the stove, and the wall clock seemed to advance faster as soon as the first strip began to sizzle. Bacon demanded attention because it could move from pale and soft to dark and brittle, while the cook was pouring juice or searching for a missing lunchbox. The strips were turned with a fork, then lifted onto a plate lined with a paper towel or brown paper to catch the grease. Some families preferred bacon crisp enough to break cleanly. Others liked it softer with a little bend remaining in the centre. Children often had definite opinions despite contributing none of the labour. One strip might be judged too fatty, another too dark, and the smallest piece could become the subject of serious negotiation between siblings. The bacon grease was not always discarded. In many kitchens, some of it was saved in a covered container near the stove or in the refrigerator ready to flavour vegetables, potatoes, gravy, or another skillet meal. What looked like breakfast waste could still have value in a household where ingredients were expected to work more than once. Sausage created a different kind of morning. Links rolled across the skillet when turned, while patties stayed in place and developed dark brown surfaces around the edges. The smell was peppery rich and impossible to keep confined to one room. Sausage could be served beside eggs placed inside a biscuit or broken into smaller pieces for children who were expected to finish everything on the plate. Regional habits mattered. Some families bought fresh sausage from a butcher, local grocery store, or nearby farm. Others used packaged links or rolls from the supermarket refrigerator case. Seasoning varied, as did the amount of fat, the size of the serving, and the frequency with which it appeared. For some children, sausage belonged to Sunday breakfast and only occasionally crossed into the school week. For others, especially in households beginning work or chores early, it was a familiar source of energy before a long morning. Scrambled eggs were often the easiest way to feed several people from the same pan. Eggs were cracked into a bowl mixed with a fork and poured into warm butter or a little of the fat left after cooking the meat. The yellow mixture spread across the skillet, then gathered into soft folds as a spoon or spatula moved it from the edges toward the center. Some families added milk, others did not. Some cooked the eggs until they were still moist, while others kept them over the heat until every surface appeared firm and dry. The difference could divide a breakfast table more effectively than any school debate. A parent preparing 4 plates had little interest in making 4 separate versions, so children generally received the household style and learned either to appreciate it or to become very efficient with ketchup. Toast filled the remaining space, catching small pieces of egg and making a limited quantity seem more substantial. The full plate reflected abundance when compared with a quick slice of toast, but it also revealed the work hidden inside a hot breakfast. Someone had to rise early enough to cook it. The skillet required watching the meat created grease. The eggs left a coating that became harder to remove as it cooled, and every plate needed a fork, a glass, and a place at the table. In families where a mother was also preparing for paid work, caring for younger children, or sending several students out at different times, such a breakfast could be difficult to manage on an ordinary weekday. Fathers, grandparents, older siblings, and other relatives sometimes handled the cooking, but the responsibility often rested with one person already carrying most of the morning routine. Advertising could show a smiling family gathered around bacon, eggs, juice, and toast, as though the entire scene had arranged itself. The dishes beside the sink told a more accurate story. Cost also shaped how often meat reached the breakfast plate. Bacon and sausage had to be divided among family members, and children noticed immediately when one plate appeared to contain a larger piece. A parent might cut bacon strips in half so the serving looked more generous, or crumble a small amount into egg so the flavor traveled farther. Sausage gravy, fried potatoes, biscuits, or extra toast could extend the meal without requiring another package of meat. In a household watching every grocery dollar, the full breakfast might be reserved for paydays, weekends, cold mornings visiting relatives, or days expected to demand more physical effort. In another home, it appeared regularly because the family raised animals bought in bulk, or simply placed a higher priority on a cooked morning meal. The picture varied widely, but the practical question remained the same. How much time and food could the family spend before the day had properly begun? When breakfast was finally served, the plate carried several temperatures and textures at once. Bacon snapped or bent. Sausage released warm juice beneath the fork. Scrambled eggs cooled quickly at the edges. Toast waited to absorb butter yolk or a trace of grease from the plate. Children who had complained of sleepiness only minutes earlier often ate with sudden concentration, although someone still had to remind them that the bus would not wait for a second sausage link. Afterward, the smell remained in coats, curtains, and the kitchen air long after the plates had been cleared. The meal was satisfying, but it was too demanding to solve every school morning. The next breakfast offered the same promise of warmth and sweetness, with a different kind of work batter poured onto a hot griddle, bubbles rising through the surface, and one imperfect pancake sacrificed so the rest could turn out properly. The first pancake was rarely the one anyone wanted. Batter met the hot griddle with a soft hiss spread into an uncertain circle, and revealed whether the pan was too cool, too hot, or simply not ready to cooperate. On a 1960s school morning, pancakes carried the atmosphere of a weekend breakfast into the middle of an ordinary weekday. A mixing bowl stood near the stove, a metal spoon or wire whisk rested against its rim, and a paper sack of flour or a box of prepared mix waited on the counter. Milk and eggs might be added according to the household recipe, although some mixes promised to reduce the number of ingredients and the amount of thinking required before sunrise. The first pancake often came out pale, uneven, or darker than intended. It was folded, eaten by the cook, handed to the least particular child, or placed at the bottom of the stack where syrup could improve its reputation. By the second round, the griddle had settled into its proper temperature, and breakfast began to look like the picture everyone had imagined. The bubbles were the signal. They appeared slowly across the wet surface, opening and remaining visible as the batter began to set around the edges. A spatula slid underneath, testing whether the pancake had browned enough to turn. Flip too early, and the center folded over itself, leaving a shape that looked less like breakfast than a map of an unfamiliar state. Wait too long, and the underside became dark while the top remained deceptively calm. A successful turn produced a quick puff of steam and a smooth golden surface. Children watched this stage with more interest than they gave most kitchen work, especially when the cook could flip the pancake in the air. That performance was not necessary, but necessity had little influence on childhood admiration. Most pancakes were turned carefully with a spatula and placed on a plate in the warming oven or beneath a clean towel while the next batch cooked. Without that effort, the first pancakes cooled before the last ones left the griddle, creating a breakfast in which every family member received a different temperature. A stack made the meal feel generous even when the pancakes themselves were thin. 2 or 3 could be arranged on a plate with a pat of butter in the center, the heat softening it into a shining yellow trail. Syrup followed first, gathering in the middle, and then moving toward the edges with no respect for the boundaries of the plate. Some families used maple-flavored table syrup from a supermarket bottle. Others served real maple syrup when it was affordable or locally available, cane syrup in parts of the South, sorghum syrup in certain households, honey molasses jelly, or simply butter and sugar. The topping revealed region, family habit, and grocery budget as clearly as the pancake recipe did. Children generally focused on quantity. A modest pour from an adult became a flood when the bottle was passed within reach. Syrup could soak through the stack, collect beneath it, and travel toward the toast or bacon without invitation. The plate became sticky. The fork became sticky. Somehow the child's elbow often became sticky as well. Pancakes made a weekday feel special because they demanded time that many school mornings did not have. Batter had to be mixed, the griddle heated, and each round cooked separately. One child might finish eating while another was still waiting for a first pancake. The cook stood at the stove rather than sitting with the family turning circles of batter while reminding everyone to keep eating and stop watching the clock. In a household sending several children to different schools or bus stops, the pancakes could be made in shifts. The oldest child ate first, the youngest remained in pajamas, and a parent tried to remember which plate had already received butter. Some families prepared pancakes only when the morning schedule began, later when weather cancelled an early obligation, or when leftovers from the batter could be saved for another meal. Others made them regularly because practice had turned the routine into something efficient. The breakfast was warm and inexpensive compared with a plate built around meat, but it consumed attention. Convenience mix shortened the measuring. It did not flip the pancakes, wipe the stove, or remove syrup from a school sleeve. Children often connected pancakes with family rituals rather than ordinary nutrition. A father or grandfather might take charge of the griddle on certain mornings, especially weekends, producing unusually large pancakes or shapes that required generous imagination to recognize. A mother might mix batter before waking the children, so the first batch was already waiting. An older sibling could be trusted to pour small circles, but not necessarily to judge when they should be turned. Some families made silver dollar pancakes small enough for several to fit on one plate. Others preferred wide pancakes that nearly covered the dish. Blueberries, sliced bananas, chopped apples, or bits of bacon occasionally entered the batter, while plain pancakes remained the dependable choice when children disagreed about everything else. A pancake could also hide small imperfections more successfully than many foods. A torn edge disappeared beneath another pancake. A dark patch accepted butter. An odd shape became the special one. Syrup was extremely forgiving. The cleanup arrived just as everyone needed to leave. Batter dried around the bowl, a spoon lay across the counter, and small drops had hardened on the stovetop. The griddle held a thin film of grease and browned batter crumbs. Plates were streaked with syrup that resisted a quick rinse, while the table carried the circular outline of a bottle someone had set down carelessly. The meal had created warmth, sweetness, and a brief sense that the family had more time than it actually did. Then coats were pulled on lunchboxes lifted, and the last pancake was folded around a piece of bacon, or eaten standing beside the sink. Pancakes survived because they could be homemade, mixed from a box, served plainly, or dressed for company. Yet on hurried mornings, even their shortened preparation could feel ambitious. The next breakfast would preserve the same golden surface and pockets of melted butter, while moving more of the work into an electric appliance, and eventually into a frost-covered box waiting behind the freezer door. The waffle iron sat on the counter with more authority than most breakfast appliances. Its metal lid was heavy, its cord stretched toward the nearest outlet, and its patterned plates promised a breakfast covered in neat square pockets. On a 1960s school morning, homemade waffles could make the kitchen feel briefly ambitious. Batter was mixed in a bowl much like pancake batter, then poured onto the hot lower plate before the lid came down with a soft clank. Almost immediately, steam escaped around the edges. If too much batter had been added, it followed the steam and pushed outward in pale ribbons that cooked against the sides of the appliance. The advertisement might have suggested effortless golden waffles. The counter usually revealed a more complicated arrangement of flour dust, a dripping spoon, a butter wrapper, and someone trying to determine whether the waffle was finished without opening the lid too soon. A waffle iron could produce a beautiful breakfast. It could also produce one firmly attached to the machine. Timing depended on the appliance, the batter, and the cook's familiarity with both. Some irons had lights or temperature controls. Others required judgment based on smell, steam, and experience. At first, the kitchen filled with the warm scent of batter and melting fat. Then the stream of vapour began to weaken, suggesting that the surface had crisped. Raise the lid too early and the waffle might separate, half remaining above and half below. Wait too long and the edges darkened while the centre became dry. A properly cooked waffle lifted away in one piece patterned with deep pockets, designed to collect whatever the family placed on top. Butter softened inside the squares. Syrup pooled in orderly little reservoirs until the plate tilted and the entire system overflowed. Powdered sugar, jam fruit, or honey appeared in some homes, but butter and syrup remained the most direct route from the appliance to a child's approval. The waffle iron turned breakfast into a sequence rather than a single serving. Unless the family owned a larger model, 1 or 2 waffles emerged at a time. The first child could be halfway finished, while the next was still waiting beside an empty plate. Finished waffles might be placed in a warm oven stacked beneath a towel, or passed directly from iron to table, with instructions to begin eating immediately. A parent stood at the counter pouring batter, lowering the lid, raising it again, and trying to remember whose turn came next. Children watched the process because the machine was more interesting than a cereal bowl. and because attention seemed necessary when breakfast was being issued in limited rounds. The oldest child might receive the first successful waffle. A younger one might inherit the torn example after being assured that it tasted exactly the same. It usually did. Syrup had a strong ability to restore equality. Homemade waffles carried the same contradiction as many convenience appliances of the period. The electric iron reduced the need to manage a griddle and flip batter by hand, but it did not remove the work. Someone still measured ingredients mixed. The bowl greased the plates when necessary, watched the steam, and cleaned the grooves afterward. Batter could bake into the corners where a dishcloth could not easily reach. Syrup dripped through the square pattern and hardened on the plate. The cord had to cool before the appliance was put away. In a family already racing towards school and work, the waffle iron was often better suited to weekends, holidays, or mornings when the household had started early. Yet some parents became quick enough to make it a weekday routine, especially when a prepared mix reduced the measuring. Familiarity could turn a complicated breakfast into an organized production. It could not make the children locate their shoes. Behind the freezer door, however, another waffle was waiting to change the arrangement. Frozen waffles had already been cooked, cooled, packaged, and stacked inside a box. In households and markets where they were available, they offered the shape and sweetness of a homemade waffle without the bowl of batter or the heavy iron. Opening the freezer released a cloud of cold air, and the box often carried a dusting of frost around the edges. The waffles inside might be separated by paper or pressed together by ice crystals, requiring a careful pull before one could be placed in the toaster. Their perfect round or rectangular shape looked remarkably consistent. No first waffle had to be sacrificed. No batter escaped across the counter. Breakfast had moved from mixing and cooking toward heating and assembling. The toaster waffle introduced its own minor difficulties. A frozen edge could catch inside a narrow toaster slot. The first cycle might warm the center without crisping the surface, while a second could darken it more quickly than expected. Some families heated frozen waffles in the oven or under the broiler, especially when several children needed breakfast at once. When the waffle emerged properly, it was crisp around the edges, warm through the middle, and ready for butter before the cold interior had any chance to return. Children could spread the toppings themselves, which reduced the cook's work while increasing the likelihood that syrup would reach the table, chair, and floor. The breakfast felt modern because much of its preparation had happened somewhere beyond the home. The family bought not merely flour and flavour, but saved minutes. Frozen waffles did not instantly replace homemade ones, nor did every household own a freezer large enough to keep boxes of breakfast food. Refrigerator freezer compartments could be small, crowded with ice trays, frozen vegetables, juice concentrate, and carefully wrapped leftovers. Space itself was a household budget. A box of waffles had to compete for it. Availability also varied by region, store, and year, and many children continue to know waffles mainly as a weekend food made in an iron. But the frozen version pointed toward a larger change already visible across the decade. Breakfast companies were learning to sell the finished form of foods that families had once mixed from basic ingredients. The package reduced preparation, standardized the result, and shifted more of breakfast toward the toaster. The two waffles could exist in the same child's memory without cancelling each other. One belonged to the hiss of batter the heavy lid and a parent standing at the counter. The other belonged to freezer frost, a cardboard box, and the freedom to prepare one serving at a time. Homemade waffles made an ordinary morning feel special because someone had invested the effort. Frozen waffles made an ordinary morning manageable because much of that effort had already been removed. Both ended with butter melting into square pockets and syrup escaping toward the edge of the plate. The next breakfast would return to the skillet, but it would begin with something even more ordinary than batter slices of yesterday's bread dipped into egg and milk and given one more useful morning. Yesterday's bread returned to the breakfast table wearing a coat of egg milk and cinnamon. On a 1960s school morning, French toast often began not with a special loaf purchased for the occasion, but with slices that had grown slightly dry in the bread box. Fresh bread could become too soft once dipped folding or tearing before it reached the skillet. Bread with a little age held together more firmly absorbed the mixture without collapsing, and gave the household one more way to use what was already there. A shallow bowl or pie plate waited on the counter, while an egg was beaten with milk, and perhaps a spoonful of sugar, a shake of cinnamon, or a drop of vanilla. Each slice was lowered into the pale mixture, turned quickly and lifted before it became too heavy. Then it met a buttered skillet with a quiet sizzle. The smell of warm bread, egg, and spice moved through the kitchen, suggesting a breakfast more elaborate than the ingredients had any right to promise. The dipping stage required judgment. Leave the bread in the bowl for only a moment and the centre remained dry. Leave it too long, and the slice became difficult to transfer without losing a corner along the way. Soft supermarket bread absorbed liquid quickly, so the cook often worked fast, dipping one side, turning it with a fork and guiding it toward the pan. Thick bakery slices allowed more time but took longer to cook through. Families used whatever bread they normally bought, and the result varied accordingly. White bread was common in many homes, but homemade loaves, wheat bread, raisin bread, or regional bakery bread could all find their way into the skillet. The breakfast did not require one official recipe. It belonged to the broad household tradition of turning a familiar staple into something warm, sweet, and worth sitting down for. The only serious rule was that the bread had to survive the journey from bowl to pan. In the skillet, the wet surface slowly became golden and firm. Butter foamed around the edges while the egg mixture cooked into the bread. A spatula slid underneath to test the first side and the slice was turned when it released cleanly from the pan. Flip too early and the surface tore. Wait too long and the cinnamon darkened into bitter patches. A properly cooked piece carried crisp brown areas on the outside while remaining soft and warm in the middle. The corners sometimes curled slightly, and the kitchen filled with the smell that made children arrive at the table before being called a second time. French toast looked more generous than ordinary toast because the bread had gained weight colour and a purpose beyond holding jelly. 2 slices could cover most of a plate. 1 slice cut into triangles might be enough for a younger child, especially with fruit milk or a piece of breakfast meat beside it. The toppings followed family custom and grocery circumstances. Syrup could be poured across the top, collecting in the shallow surface and running toward the plate. Powdered sugar created a snowy layer that looked impressive until the first breath sent part of it toward the table. Some families used granulated sugar and cinnamon, while others served jelly preserves, honey molasses, or nothing beyond butter. Fresh berries were wonderful when available, but canned peaches, applesauce, sliced banana, or a spoonful of fruit preserves were more dependable in many kitchens. Children often preferred enough syrup to remove any doubt that breakfast was sweet. Adults attempted restraint, usually by controlling the bottle themselves. The toast absorbed the topping quickly, so hesitation was dangerous. A slice left untouched while a child searched for a pencil could become cool and heavy, its crisp edges softened beneath a shining layer of syrup. French toast rewarded attention. The school clock did not always permit it, for the person cooking the breakfast stretched ingredients but multiplied small tasks. Eggs and milk had to be mixed. Bread-dipped slices turned and several batches kept warm. The skillet held only so much at once. One child might receive the first pieces while another waited for the next round, watching the pan with the intensity normally reserved for Saturday cartoons. The cook often stood while everyone else ate, adding butter between batches and adjusting the burner when the pan became too hot. The final slices tended to brown faster because the skillet had been heating for several minutes. Bits of cooked egg gathered around the edges and cinnamon left dark flecks in the butter. By the time the last plate was served, the first child might already be asking for another piece. This was flattering in theory, and inconvenient when the bowl of dipping mixture was nearly empty. The answer depended on the remaining bread, the remaining eggs, and exactly how close the bus was. French toast could also carry the quiet logic of thrift. Bread was too useful to waste casually. It had already served at dinner, held sandwiches for lunch, and waited beside soup or eggs. When it lost its first-day softness, it could become toast bread crumbs, pudding, stuffing, or a skillet breakfast. Turning older bread into French toast did not feel like serving leftovers in the ordinary sense. The egg coating, butter, cinnamon, and syrup gave it a new identity. Children who might have rejected a dry slice rarely objected once it arrived golden and sweet. The transformation showed the kind of household skill that seldom appeared in grand historical accounts, knowing which food needed to be used, how to change its texture, and how to make economy look like a treat. The meal was inexpensive compared with a breakfast built around several pieces of meat, but it was not careless. It depended on timing attention, and a cook who understood that one more morning could still be found inside yesterday's loaf. When the plates were cleared, the evidence remained in the skillet browned butter, cooked threads of egg, and a few fragments of bread that had not completed the journey. The mixing bowl carried a thin yellow coating that would dry quickly if left beside the sink. Syrup marked the table, powdered sugar dusted a sleeve, and the bread box was lighter than it had been at sunrise. French toast had taken something ordinary and made the school morning feel briefly generous. Yet another bread and egg breakfast could be prepared with even fewer dishes. It began when a drinking glass pressed a circle from the centre of a slice, leaving a hole just large enough for an egg to cook inside. A drinking glass pressed into the centre of a slice of bread and left behind a neat round hole. The small bread circle was set beside the stove rather than thrown away because it could be toasted in the same skillet and eaten with the rest. Butter melted across the pan, the prepared slice was lowered into it, and an egg was cracked directly into the opening. On a 1960s school morning, this breakfast turned two familiar ingredients into something that looked almost invented for children. The white spread until it reached the bread on every side, while the yolk remained bright in the middle like a yellow button. Families knew the dish by many names, including egg in a hole, egg in a basket, one-eyed egg, and several others that changed by region and household. No single name ruled the American kitchen. The important part was the arrangement: bread around the outside egg in the centre, and one skillet containing nearly the entire breakfast. Cutting the hole was the first small ceremony. A biscuit cutter worked neatly when one was available, but an ordinary glass was more common because it was already within reach. The rim had to be narrow enough to leave a border of bread around the egg. Cut too large a circle and the remaining frame became weak and tore when turned. Cut too small a one, and the egg white climbed over the bread instead of staying inside it. Children sometimes asked to press the glass themselves, leaning down with both hands as though performing important kitchen engineering. The removed centre became a bonus piece browned in butter and used for dipping into the yolk. In families where nothing useful was wasted, that little circle had an unquestioned future. It might be handed to the youngest child claimed by the cook, or returned to the centre of the finished slice like a lid that no longer quite fit. Once the bread reached the skillet, timing became the entire meal. The first side toasted briefly in butter, or a little saved bacon fat before the egg was added. Some cooks cracked the egg into a cup first, making it easier to pour without dropping shell into the opening. Others cracked it directly over the bread and trusted experience. The white began clear, then slowly turned opaque from the edges inward. A lid placed over the skillet helped the top cook without forcing the bottom of the bread to remain over the heat too long. Other families flipped the entire slice a maneuver, requiring a wide spatula and a certain amount of courage. A successful turn kept the yolk intact and browned the second side evenly. An unsuccessful one sent egg white toward the edge of the pan and left the bread folded over itself. Breakfast remained edible, but its carefully designed appearance became more difficult to explain. Children often judge the meal by the condition of the yolk. A soft center gave the toast something warm and rich to absorb. The first cut released yellow yolk through the opening, and the toasted bread circle could be dipped into it before the rest was eaten with a fork. A firmer yolk made the breakfast easier to manage and less likely to land on a shirt 5 minutes before leaving for school. Families differed sharply in what counted as properly cooked. Some wanted the white set and the yolk loose. Others insisted that every part of the egg be firm. A parent preparing several slices might try to remember who preferred which version, but the skillet did not always cooperate. The first egg could remain soft while the second cooked through, and the last slice often received more heat simply because the pan was now fully warm. Children discovered that household breakfast preferences were respected when convenient and overruled when the bus was approaching. The dish made practical sense because it combined the egg and toast instead of requiring separate space and attention for each. One pan could cook the entire plate, and the bread absorbed the butter egg and any small amount of seasoning added at the stove. Salt and pepper were enough in many homes. Others used paprika, grated cheese, a thin slice of ham, or a spoonful of ketchup after serving, although additions depended on family taste and what the refrigerator contained. The breakfast could feel playful without requiring a packaged product or a special ingredient. It was also easy to adjust. One slice suited a younger child. 2 could feed an older student with a long morning ahead. If eggs were limited, the bread still made the plate look substantial. If bread needed to be used before it dried out, the skillet gave it a new purpose. The meal belonged to the same practical tradition as French toast, but it preserved the egg as a visible center rather than soaking it into the bread. Its many names reveal how household foods travel without carrying official instructions. A child might grow up believing that one-eyed toast was the only possible name, then meet someone years later who called the same breakfast egg in a basket. Another family might have a private nickname that never appeared in a cookbook at all. Similar bread and egg dishes had been known for years, but their exact origin is difficult to reduce to one kitchen or one inventor. Recipes circulated through families' newspapers, community cookbooks, military memories, and casual instruction at the stove. A parent did not need to know where the dish began in order to make it before school. The technique could be explained in less than a minute. Cut the whole butter. The pan. Add the bread, crack the egg, and watch it carefully. Its simplicity allowed it to pass from one generation to another without much written evidence, which is often how the most memorable household breakfasts survive. The finished slice arrived on the plate crisp around the edges and softer where the egg had met the bread. The little toasted circle waited beside it, ready for dipping, while a glass of milk or juice completed the meal. Compared with cereal, it asked for a skillet and several extra minutes. Compared with bacon, eggs, and sausage, it looked almost economical. It was warm, filling, slightly playful, and easy for a child to remember, because breakfast had been given a shape. Afterward, the pan held only butter, a trace of cooked white, and a few toasted crumbs. The glass returned to the cupboard, the bread bag was folded closed, and the child headed toward the door with a meal that had turned 2 ordinary ingredients into one carefully fitted design. The next breakfast would be heavier, softer, and deeply regional arriving. A split biscuits disappeared beneath peppered sausage gravy. A biscuit split open beneath sausage gravy did not look hurried even when the entire kitchen was racing toward the school bell. On many southern school mornings in the 1960s, the plate arrived warm and pale with pepper-speckled gravy spreading across the biscuit's rough interior and softening its browned edges. The sausage had already announced itself from the skillet, filling the room with the smell of meat, black pepper, and hot fat. Nearby, a tray of biscuits might rest beneath a folded dish towel, their tops brushed with butter or left floury and plain. This was not a universal southern breakfast, and it did not appear every morning in every household. Family income, work schedules, local custom, and the skill of the person at the stove all mattered. But where biscuits and gravy belonged to the routine, they offered warmth, thrift, and enough weight to carry a child through a long ride to school and several hours before lunch. The biscuits themselves could tell a family story before the gravy touched them. In one kitchen, they began with flour measured into a bowl shortening or lard cut through it, and buttermilk added until a soft dough formed. Experienced hands worked quickly because too much handling could make the biscuits firm rather than tender. The dough was patted on a floured counter and cut with a biscuit cutter, an empty can, or the rim of a drinking glass. In another home, the cook shaped the dough by hand without measuring every piece. Some families relied on baking mix, while others opened refrigerated dough when time was short and the grocery budget allowed it. Children rarely cared which method had produced the biscuit once it reached the table. They cared whether it was hot, whether it opened cleanly, and whether there was enough gravy to cover both halves. Adults noticed the difference in time. Homemade biscuits required ingredients practice a hot oven, and flour that seemed capable of reaching every nearby surface. The gravy began with sausage browned and broken into small pieces in a skillet. After the meat was removed or pushed aside, the drippings remained, carrying the flavour that made the sauce more than warm milk poured over bread. Flour was stirred into the fat, then milk was added and worked until the mixture thickened. Black pepper appeared generously in many versions, leaving dark specks across the pale gravy. The exact method varied from family to family. Some gravy was thick enough to sit on the biscuit without moving. Some spread across the plate and reached the eggs before anyone could object. Some contained crumbled sausage throughout, while other households served the meat separately and used the flavoured drippings to build the sauce. A hurried cook had to watch closely. Add the milk too quickly and lumps formed. Leave the skillet unattended and the bottom could scorch. The gravy promised to stretch a modest amount of sausage across several plates, but it still expected someone to stand at the stove and persuade it into smoothness. For households feeding several children, that ability to stretch flavour mattered. A package of sausage might not provide every child with several links or patties, but broken into gravy it could reach each biscuit. The bread supplied most of the volume. The milk and flour carried the savoury taste farther. One biscuit covered generously could feel more satisfying than a small piece of meat placed alone beside toast. Older children might receive two, especially if they had chores before school or a long day ahead. Younger ones sometimes received a biscuit torn into smaller pieces, so the gravy cooled faster and could be managed with a fork. The meal reflected practical household arithmetic: make the breakfast filling, use the drippings rather than wasting them, and divide what was available so the table looked fair. Fairness remained open to interpretation. A child who discovered more sausage pieces on a sibling's plate could conduct a complete inspection before taking the first bite. The breakfast also carried strong regional and family differences. Biscuits and gravy were especially familiar in parts of the South and Appalachia, as well as in some rural working-class and migrant family traditions beyond those boundaries. Yet the phrase Southern breakfast covered many kitchens, including black-white indigenous immigrant farm, small town and city households, whose recipes and resources were not identical. One family used buttermilk because it was part of the household routine. Another used ordinary milk, One seasoned the gravy heavily with pepper, another kept it mild for children. Some served eggs, preserves, fried apples, or grits alongside the biscuits. Others served only the biscuit and gravy because that was enough. Community cookbooks and family recipe boxes preserved many versions, but much of the knowledge never needed to be written down. It travelled by watching the skillet, feeling the dough and learning when the gravy had thickened enough to leave a path behind the spoon. Children experienced the plate differently from the adult who prepared it. To a hungry child, the soft biscuit and creamy gravy could feel comforting, especially on a dark winter morning when the kitchen was warmer than the road outside. To a child already running late, it could seem almost too substantial. The biscuit had to be cut, the gravy was too hot at first, and every bite required sitting still. This was not a breakfast easily carried toward the door. A parent might break the biscuit apart to release steam, add a little cold milk at the edge of the plate, or warn the child for the third time that the bus would not wait for the gravy to cool. School clothes faced their own danger. One careless forkful could leave a pale spot on a clean shirt, followed by hurried wiping that usually made the spot larger. Biscuits and gravy demanded a chair, a plate, and several minutes of cooperation from a morning that was not always willing to provide them. After the children left the kitchen revealed what the breakfast had cost in labour. The mixing bowl held streaks of dough flour covered the counter, and the skillet carried a cooling layer of gravy around its edges. The baking pan needed washing, the biscuit cloth needed shaking, and the stove held small drops of milk and grease. Yet the meal had used ordinary ingredients to create something generous, and its memory remained tied to more than taste. It recalled the warmth of the oven, the peppery smell in the hallway, the scrape of a fork through gravy, and the person who had risen early enough to make it happen. The next breakfast would keep the grain bowl but remove the oven and sausage. A pot of grits would thicken quietly on the stove, waiting for butter, salt, sugar, or whichever choice the family considered unquestionably correct. The pot of grits began as little more than water salt and pale grains falling in a steady stream. On a 1960s school morning, the mixture looked almost too plain to become breakfast, but a few minutes over, the burner changed it completely. The grains swelled, the water clouded, and the spoon began meeting resistance as the pot thickened. Steam rose toward the cabinet doors, carrying the mild scent of corn through the kitchen. In many southern households, grits were as familiar as toast or oatmeal, though they were never prepared in exactly the same way everywhere. Some children received a soft bowl that moved easily beneath the spoon. Others knew grits cooked thick enough to hold their shape. The first addition was often butter placed in the centre while the bowl was still hot. It melted slowly into a yellow pool, and conversation could wait until someone had stirred it through. Cooking grits required more attention than their short ingredient list suggested. The grains had to be added gradually to prevent clumps, then stirred often enough to keep them from settling against the bottom of the pot. A distracted cook could return to find a scorched layer forming beneath breakfast, while the surface still appeared perfectly innocent. Hot grits also had a habit of bubbling unexpectedly, sending small bursts toward the hand holding the spoon. The burner had to be lowered once the mixture began to thicken, and the pot could not be ignored for long. Quick cooking varieties reduced the waiting time in many kitchens, but even they needed water-measured salt judged and a spoon moving through the pot. Breakfast advertisements could promise speed. The saucepan still expected supervision. Butter was the safest point of agreement. A pat dropped into the bowl, disappeared along the edges, and gave the mild corn flavour more richness. After that, family law took over. Salt and black pepper were common additions in many households. Some children stirred in a little milk to cool the bowl and loosen its texture. Cheese might appear when the refrigerator held enough, and the family preferred a savoury breakfast. crumbled bacon sausage drippings, or an egg could make the grits more substantial on mornings when other foods were already cooking. Then there was sugar. In some families, sweetening grits was ordinary. In others, it was treated as a misunderstanding requiring immediate correction. Children learned early that asking how someone ate grits could reveal more about a household than several polite questions about where it lived. The bowl itself changed while it waited. Fresh from the pot grits were too hot for a hurried first bite. A child might stir from the outer edge toward the center, blow across the spoon, or pour in cold milk. Leave the bowl untouched while searching for a school book, however, and the surface began to firm. Within a few minutes, the soft breakfast could become dense enough for the spoon to leave a lasting path. A small skin sometimes formed across the top, especially after the melted butter had been stirred away. The child who returned late faced a breakfast that was cooler but no longer quite the same food. More milk could rescue it. So could vigorous stirring. The wall clock remained unsympathetic. Grits wanted to be eaten at the moment between dangerously hot and unexpectedly solid a window roughly as narrow as the time remaining before the bus. For families watching the grocery budget, grits made practical sense. Dry corn grits stored well, a small amount expanded in the pot, and the finished bowl could be adjusted according to appetite. A younger child needed only a modest serving. An older student could receive a deeper bowl with toast eggs or meat beside it. In homes where breakfast had to feed several children, the pot allowed everyone to be served from the same basic preparation. Yet calling the meal inexpensive should not make it seem unimportant. A bowl of grits could carry family identity, regional memory, and the steady work of a person who knew how thick the mixture should be without consulting written instructions. The spoon, not the measuring cup, often decided when breakfast was ready. Grits also remind us that there was no single 1960s American breakfast. A cereal advertisement might show one national morning, but actual kitchens followed local traditions, racial and ethnic foodways, rural habits, family income and recipes brought from earlier generations. Grits were especially rooted in the South, with deep connections to indigenous corn traditions and to the cooking of black and white Southern communities, though those histories were not identical and should not be flattened into one story. Some children ate them nearly every week. Others encountered them only while visiting relatives. Many American children outside the region had never seen a bowl at all. Even within the same town, one table served grits with salt and butter, while another added sugar cheese gravy or an egg. The dish was familiar, but familiarity did not mean uniformity. By the time the bowl was empty, a thin coating remained along the sides where the grits had cooled. The spoon scraped through it with a sound different from cereal or oatmeal, and the pot beside the sink already showed what would happen if it were not soaked quickly. Once dried, the remains clung with remarkable confidence. Still, the breakfast had done its work. It had warmed, the child stretched a pantry staple, and carried a recognizable family taste into the school day. The next cornmeal breakfast would be even more determined not to waste anything. It might be served soft with syrup one morning, then chilled, sliced and fried the next, proving that a pot of humble grain could return to the table in an entirely different form. Cornmeal mush began in a pot that looked almost too plain to hold a memory. Water came to a simmer, salt was added, and yellow or white cornmeal fell in a careful stream, while a spoon moved constantly through the liquid. On a 1960s school morning, the mixture thickened, slowly turning from cloudy water into something smooth, warm and substantial enough to hold a child until lunch. It could be served immediately in a bowl with buttermilk, sugar, molasses, honey or syrup, depending on the family and the region. Yet its greatest usefulness often appeared the next day. What remained in the pot was poured into a loaf pan bowl or shallow dish and left to cool. By morning, the soft mush had become firm enough to slice. A breakfast that looked finished the night before returned to the table browned in a skillet, crisp at the edges and ready to carry syrup. Nothing dramatic had happened. The household had simply refused to waste what the cornmeal could still become. Making the soft version required patience similar to cooking grits, though the texture and traditions were not identical. Cornmeal could clump the moment it struck hot water, so the cook poured slowly and stirred without stopping. Once the mixture began to thicken, it could spit from the pot in small hot bursts, leaving yellow dots on the stove and occasionally on the hand holding the spoon. The burner was lowered, and the mush continued cooking until the raw grain taste softened and the spoon dragged heavily through the centre. Some families used milk for part of the liquid. Others relied entirely on water and added richness at the table. A bowl served immediately might receive a pat of butter that melted into a glossy pool, followed by a ribbon of dark syrup or a spoonful of sugar. Children who preferred sweetness stirred until the entire bowl changed colour. Those given only butter and salt learned that breakfast did not always intend to behave like dessert. The leftovers were where household skill became visible. Warm mush was poured into a container while it was still soft enough to settle into an even shape. Covered and cooled, it became firm overnight. In the morning, a knife cut it into slices that might be thin and crisp or thick and soft in the centre. The slices entered a skillet greased with butter bacon drippings lard or another cooking fat already used in the household. At first they sat quietly pale and fragile. As the bottoms browned, they developed a crust strong enough to survive turning. Flip them too soon, and the slices broke, leaving pieces that still tasted fine but no longer looked orderly. Wait too long, and the outside darkened while the centre remained cool. A well-cooked slice emerged golden brown along the edges, warm inside and sturdy enough to support syrup without immediately dissolving beneath it. Syrup transformed the plate. Maple syrup appeared in some homes, particularly where it was produced locally, or considered worth the cost, but many families used maple-flavoured table syrup cane, syrup sorghum molasses, honey, or whatever sweetener the pantry supplied. The thick liquid ran across the fried surface gathered in the shallow cracks and softened the crisp crust bite by bite. Some children added butter first, letting it disappear before the syrup arrived. Others cut the slices into squares and tried to ensure that each piece received an equal share. Equal shares were rarely achieved. One corner might remain almost dry while another floated in sweetness. The final forkful often collected the syrup left on the plate, proving that cornmeal mush could become far more appealing once the bottle had been entrusted to a child. Adults tended to pour with greater restraint, which children interpreted as a difference in philosophy rather than grocery budgeting. Cornmeal mush was especially useful in households where inexpensive staples had to perform more than one job. A bag of cornmeal could become mush cornbread breading dumplings or part of another meal. The soft breakfast stretched easily with additional water, and the chilled remainder could feed the family again without starting from the beginning. This practice was not limited to one region or one kind of household. Versions appeared in rural kitchens, farm homes, working-class neighbourhoods and communities with German Appalachian, Midwestern, Southern black, white and other food traditions. Names and methods differed. Some families called it mush. Others knew related dishes under regional or inherited names. Preparation could be sweet or savoury, soft or fried plain, or served beside eggs and meat. The broad lesson remained the same. Grain was valuable, leftovers were ingredients, and breakfast did not need to look identical on its second appearance. Children sometimes recognized fried mush as a treat without understanding that it had begun as yesterday's economy. The crisp exterior and syrup made it feel different from a plain bowl of hot cereal. The slices could be eaten with a fork picked up by the edge when no adult objected or placed beside an egg for a more substantial plate. Their regular shape made them look planned even when they existed because the previous batch had been larger than the family needed. This was one of the quiet achievements of household cooking. Food that might have seemed repetitive returned with a new texture, a new temperature, and a new name. The child saw a browned slice. The cook saw a pot that had supplied 2 breakfasts. Such transformations mattered in homes where payday was still several days away. The nearest store required a trip, or wasting food carried moral as well as financial weight. After breakfast, the skillet held a few yellow crumbs and dark traces of syrup that would become sticky if left to cool. The remaining loaf of firm mush might return to the refrigerator for another morning, carefully covered against drying. A spoon rested in the sink beside the pot from the day before, and the cornmeal bag went back to the pantry, with enough left for cornbread or another batch. Fried mush did not vanish entirely as the decades changed, but it gradually lost ground in many homes to boxed cereals, frozen waffles, toaster pastries and other products that required no advance planning. Its memory remained strongest in families that valued the crisp edges, the syrup, and the knowledge that breakfast had wasted almost nothing. The next plate would also carry an older practical tradition, though its pale gravy and thin pieces of dried beef would connect the family kitchen to military mess halls and the memories brought home by veterans. The dried beef came from a small glass jar, a paper-wrapped package, or another tightly sealed container, its thin, pinkish slices pressed together and edged with salt. On a 1960s school morning, creamed chipped beef on toast looked very different from the bright cereal boxes and syrup-covered pancakes competing for children's attention. Toast lay across the plate beneath a pale cream sauce, while narrow pieces of beef appeared through the gravy like strips of faded red ribbon. Black pepper dotted the surface and steam softened the toast almost as soon as the plate reached the table. In households where a father, grandfather, uncle, or older brother had served in the armed forces, the dish could arrive, carrying a military association before anyone explained it. Some veterans remembered versions served in mess halls. Some asked for it at home because it was familiar, filling, and inexpensive to reproduce. Others had eaten enough of it during their service and showed no desire to meet it again before breakfast. The sauce began with fat melting in a skillet or saucepan. Butter was common in home kitchens, although other fats could be used according to habit and budget. Flour was stirred into the melted fat until it formed a smooth paste, then milk was added gradually. The spoon or whisk had to keep moving as the mixture thickened. Add the milk too quickly and pale lumps appeared. Stop stirring, and the bottom could scorch while the surface remained calm. Once the sauce became smooth, the chipped beef was separated into strips or torn into smaller pieces and stirred through it. Because dried beef was heavily salted, some cooks rinsed or soaked it briefly before adding it. Others relied on the milk sauce to soften the saltiness and simply avoided putting the salt shaker anywhere near the stove. Pepper supplied the usual contrast, leaving dark specks across the creamy surface and a warm bite at the end of each mouthful. Toast gave the sauce somewhere to go. 2 slices might be placed side by side, cut diagonally, or stacked slightly so the plate looked fuller. The gravy was spooned over the centre, spreading toward the crust and soaking downward. The first bites retained some crispness around the edges. The last bites were soft enough to cut with the side of a fork. Children who liked gravy often accepted the arrangement without hesitation. Those suspicious of pale sauces began by lifting one corner of toast to inspect what had happened underneath. The beef itself could be chewy, salty, or surprisingly tender, depending on the product and preparation. A piece that seemed small on the fork could require more attention than expected, especially when the school bus was approaching. The dish did not offer the sweetness of cinnamon toast or the cheerful geometry of a waffle. Its appeal was warmer and more practical hot milk gravy, toasted bread, and enough savoury flavour to make a modest amount of meat reach several plates. For a family watching the grocery budget, chipped beef performed best when used as seasoning rather than as the entire meal. A relatively small quantity could be distributed throughout a pan of sauce, allowing each child to receive pieces of meat without placing a full portion beside every serving. Flour and milk created the volume. Toast supplied the foundation. The arrangement resembled sausage gravy in its household logic, though the flavour and cultural associations were different. One jar or package might feed several people when stretched carefully, particularly if eggs, fruit, or potatoes were not expected on the same plate. A younger child could receive one slice beneath the gravy. An older student might receive two. When someone asked why one plate seemed to contain more beef than another, the cook could stir the sauce and insist that the pieces had been distributed fairly. Gravy has concealed many forms of family arithmetic. Its military reputation came from more than a vague story repeated at breakfast tables. Creamed dried or chipped beef appeared in American military cookbooks and became one of the meals remembered strongly by service members across generations. The armed forces needed recipes that could be prepared in large quantities from preserved ingredients divided consistently and served with bread or toast. Dried beef fit that system well. Veterans later carried both the recipe and its reputation into civilian life, sometimes requesting it at home, and sometimes joking about the frequency with which they had encountered it. The meal acquired a famous military nickname that was not suitable for every family breakfast conversation, although many children eventually heard it from an adult who believed the younger people at the table were not listening. In veteran households, the dish could therefore feel less like a forgotten recipe and more like an old institutional memory reduced to one skillet and 4 plates. Yet it would be misleading to suggest that every veteran's family served it, or that every child recognized it. Some households knew a similar dish as creamed dried beef, chipped beef gravy, or simply creamed beef on toast. Others never prepared it at all. Availability differed, and family taste had more authority than military tradition once breakfast entered the home. A veteran who disliked the dish could banish it from the kitchen just as easily as another could request it. Some mothers and grandmothers had already known creamed meat sauces through home-cooking hotel menus, diners, or community recipes, so the military connection was only one path by which it reached the table. The dish also appeared beyond veteran households because it used familiar white sauce technique and shelf-stable or refrigerated meat. Like many practical breakfasts, it resisted a single neat origin story. It survived wherever its ingredients, price and taste continued to make sense. The school morning difficulty was time. The sauce had to be stirred, the toast had to appear at the right moment, and the finished plate was too hot and soft to carry toward the door. A child could not fold it in half like peanut butter toast. It required a fork, a chair, and enough patience to work through gravy-soaked bread while an adult repeated the time. Afterward, the pan carried a white coating around its sides, the serving spoon rested in the sink, and small pieces of dried beef clung to whatever gravy remained. As convenience foods expanded, breakfast like this became less visible in many family kitchens. The dish never disappeared completely, but its connection to military generations and slower skillet mornings weakened. For those who remember it, however, the image remains clear peppered cream gravy over toast, a veteran at the table, and a breakfast whose pale appearance concealed a surprisingly durable history. The next shortcut would be sweeter, cleaner, and far easier to sell to children arriving as a package of donuts beside a cold glass of milk. The donuts arrived already finished, stacked inside a waxed paper sleeve arranged beneath clear cellophane, or carried home in a small bakery box tied with string. On a 1960s school morning, that alone made them remarkable. No batter waited in a bowl, no skillet required watching, and no toast had to be rescued from a setting chosen the night before. A parent opened the package, placed 1 or 2 donuts on a plate, and poured a glass of milk while the rest of the household continued searching for books, gloves, and lunch money. The breakfast was sweet, soft, and instantly acceptable to most children. It was not necessarily served every day, and many parents would have considered it a treat rather than a proper weekday routine. But when time had collapsed, the refrigerator was nearly empty, or someone had brought home a package from the grocery store. Donuts could settle the breakfast question with unusual speed. Children rarely demanded a longer explanation. Packaged donuts came in several familiar forms. Powdered varieties left a white coating on fingertips, lips, and any dark school clothing unfortunate enough to pass nearby. Plain cake donuts were denser, slightly dry, and especially dependent on the glass of milk beside them. Chocolate-covered donuts promised a neat outer shell, but often softened in a warm kitchen, attaching themselves to waxed paper and requiring careful removal. Glazed donuts from a bakery or shop could be lighter and stickier, their surfaces shining beneath the kitchen light. Some families bought them from a neighborhood bakery, where the box still carried warmth and the smell of frying oil and sugar. Others found packaged versions in the supermarket bread aisle on a snack shelf or near the bakery department. Availability varied by town and region, but the larger change was clear. Breakfast no longer had to be assembled entirely from ingredients inside the home. It could arrive ready to eat, protected by packaging and waiting for the cupboard door to open. Milk gave the meal enough seriousness to resemble breakfast rather than an early encounter with dessert. A cold glass balanced the sweetness and helped with the dry crumb of a cake donut. Children developed their own methods. Some took a bite and followed it immediately with milk. Others dipped the edge of the donut into the glass, holding it there just long enough to soften without losing half of it beneath the surface. Adults did not always approve of dipping, particularly when several children shared a milk bottle or when crumbs collected visibly at the bottom of the glass. The rule against dipping was simple. Enforcement depended on whether the parent had turned toward the stove. A plain donut could absorb milk quickly, becoming tender and heavy. A powdered one created a pale film across the surface. A chocolate-covered version required greater care because melted coating on the rim of a glass was the kind of evidence that remained after the child had left for school. The powdered sugar created its own school morning hazards. A child could begin breakfast in a clean shirt and finish looking as though a small flour sack had burst near the collar. The first bite pressed powder toward the nose. The second sent it onto the plate. Breathing at the wrong moment lifted a faint white cloud from the surface. Parents learned to place a napkin beneath the donut or instruct the child to lean over the table, advice that was heard with varying levels of commitment. The sugar also collected in the folds of waxed paper at the bottom of the package. Once the final donut was gone, someone usually discovered that loose powder and considered it too valuable to waste. A fingertip entered the wrapper. The wrapper tilted. Then came the quiet rustle of a child attempting to consume the remains without attracting adult attention. Packaged donuts demanded almost no preparation, but they still produced crumbs, sticky fingers, and a counter that needed wiping. For households balancing work, school, and limited morning time, the package could be useful, even when no one pretended it represented the ideal breakfast. A parent leaving early for a shift might set out donuts before waking the children. An older sibling could distribute them without operating the stove. A family traveling, visiting relatives, or dealing with an unusually chaotic morning could eat quickly and move on. Donuts also appeared after church events, family gatherings, bakery trips, and weekends, with leftovers quietly becoming Monday breakfast. In homes watching the grocery budget, a package might be divided carefully so that each child received the same number. The largest donut did not escape notice. Neither did the one with the most chocolate. Parents could insist that all pieces were identical, but children understood geometry when sugar was involved. The shortcut carried a small conflict between pleasure and respectability. Children saw a sweet breakfast that required no persuasion. Adults sometimes saw an emergency solution that should not become a habit. Period advertisements increasingly encouraged families to purchase foods that saved time. But household ideas about a proper breakfast did not change all at once. Eggs, cereal, oatmeal, toast fruit, and milk still carried stronger claims to weekday legitimacy in many kitchens. Donuts occupied a flexible category. They could be a treat, a convenience, a bakery tradition, a reward or evidence that the morning plan had failed somewhere before 7 o'clock. The same parent who served them cheerfully on Saturday might apologize for them on Tuesday. The child eating one rarely required the apology. Not every child knew packaged donuts as a school breakfast. Some families baked or fried their own. Some bought pastries only for company or Sunday mornings. Others avoided them because of cost preference, dietary restrictions, or simple household custom. Yet the memory remains powerful because the package changed the mood of the table. The crinkle of cellophane meant there would be no waiting for a pan. The smell of sugar arrived before the plate, a glass of milk stood ready, and breakfast could be finished in the time usually required to argue about oatmeal. Donuts represented a form of convenience that asked the family to do almost nothing beyond opening, pouring, and cleaning the evidence from a child's shirt. The next sweet breakfast would bring some of the work back into the kitchen. A cardboard tube would be pressed against the counter, release a startling pop, and reveal spirals of refrigerated dough waiting to rise in the oven. The cardboard tube waited in the refrigerator door or beside the milk wrapped in a label that promised warm rolls without the mixing bowl flour-covered counter or long rising time. On a 1960s school morning opening, it could become the loudest moment before sunrise. The cook peeled away the outer paper until a spiral seam appeared, then pressed the tube against the edge of the counter, or worked a spoon beneath the marked line. For several seconds nothing happened. Then the container released with a sharp pop, the dough pushed outward, and everyone in the kitchen reacted as though breakfast had made a small announcement. Inside were pale spirals pressed closely together, already shaped and ready for the baking pan. They did not look especially impressive while cold. But once the oven warmed and cinnamon began filling the room, the household could briefly pretend that someone had risen before dawn to prepare pastries from scratch. Refrigerated dough belonged to a growing category of foods that moved part of the cook's labour out of the home, while leaving just enough work behind to feel homemade. The rolls still had to be separated, arranged in a greased pan, baked and watched carefully. They did not arrive warm, and they did not clean the pan afterward. Yet the measuring, kneading, rolling, filling and waiting had already been handled somewhere beyond the kitchen. For a parent trying to prepare children for school, that difference mattered. The tube could be opened while coffee heated and lunches were packed. The dough spirals were placed with a little space between them, though children often wanted to press them tightly together or unroll one to inspect the cinnamon stripe hidden inside. The pan entered the oven, the timer was set, and breakfast began cooking without anyone standing over a skillet. Convenience had not removed the morning clock, but it had given the cook a few minutes to do something else. The oven transformed the rolls slowly enough to test everyone's patience. At first, the dough remained pale and separate. Then the spirals began to rise, touching at the edges and filling the empty spaces in the pan. Butter and cinnamon softened between the layers, and the smell travelled farther than the size of the breakfast suggested. Children who'd ignored repeated calls to get dressed suddenly appeared in the kitchen to ask whether the rolls were ready. The answer was usually no. Open the oven too often and heat escaped. Remove the pan too early and the centers remained soft and doughy. Leave it too long and the bottom browned faster than the tops revealed. The cook watched for swelling edges and a warm golden colour, using the package instructions as a guide but relying on the oven's personality as well. Many household ovens had their own ideas about temperature, and the back row of rolls could finish before the front had made up its mind. The icing completed the promise. Depending on the product and package, it might come in a small container packet or separate portion waiting to be spread after baking. The rolls needed to cool briefly, although children considered this pause an unnecessary administrative delay. Applied too soon, the icing melted into a thin glaze and ran toward the bottom of the pan. Applied after a few minutes, it remained thicker and formed white ribbons across the warm spirals. A spoon moved from one roll to the next while everyone quietly inspected whether the portions looked equal. The center roll often appeared larger because the surrounding dough had pushed against it from every direction. Corner rolls developed firmer outer edges. Each child formed a preference and defended it as though the baking pan had created several completely different foods. The cook who had opened the tube, arranged the dough, watched the oven and spread the icing, usually received whichever roll remained after the negotiations ended. Refrigerated cinnamon rolls were easier than scratch baking, but they were not always the fastest breakfast on the table. The oven needed time to heat the rolls required baking, and the pan emerged too hot for immediate handling. A family had to begin early enough for the process to finish before coats and lunch boxes reached the door. This made the rolls more likely on mornings with a little extra time on special school days, or when a parent wanted to make an ordinary weekday feel generous without beginning with flour and yeast. The tube could also appear when cousins stayed overnight, when someone had a birthday, or when a grocery store promotion placed it within the week's budget. Compared with cereal or toast, the rolls cost more time. Compared with traditional cinnamon rolls made from scratch, they compressed a long kitchen project into a manageable routine. The package did not create leisure. It simply reduced the number of ways breakfast could go wrong. Children remembered the pop because it made the food feel almost mechanical. A quiet container suddenly opened itself, revealing dough arranged with factory precision. The moment belonged to the same decade that increasingly placed frozen waffles, instant drinks, prepared mixes, and other shortcuts into the family kitchen. Yet the finished rolls still produced an old-fashioned effect. They warmed the room, scented the hallway, and arrived together in a baking pan rather than one serving at a time. Family members pulled them apart while the dough was still tender, leaving thin strands between neighbouring spirals. Fingers became sticky. Icing reached the edge of a plate. Cinnamon settled into the folds of the roll where the soft centre remained warmer than the outside. The meal could feel homemade to a child because it came from the oven and because someone had served it warm. The package had hidden the earlier work, not the final care. After breakfast, the empty tube lay in the trash with its peeled label curling away, while the baking pan held hardened streaks of sugar and cinnamon. A few crumbs remained where the rolls had been separated, and a spoon carried a white coating that would become stubborn if left beside the sink. The shortcut had saved mixing and rising, but cleanup remained loyal to tradition. Refrigerated dough products continued to grow more familiar, as American families looked for foods that balanced warmth with speed, though availability and household use varied across regions and years. For some children, the popping tube became a regular sound. For others, it marked a rare morning when breakfast smelled like a bakery. The next part of the story would move away from warm dough and toward two colder sights: a grapefruit half sparkling beneath sugar and a small frozen can waiting to turn into orange juice. The grapefruit half arrived on a small plate with its cut surface facing upward, each pale pink or yellow section separated by thin white walls. On a 1960s school morning it looked orderly, bright and slightly formal beside the cereal bowl or toast plate. A spoonful of sugar might sparkle across the top, softening the sharpness and making the fruit appear as though frost had settled indoors. Some kitchens owned special grapefruit spoons with pointed, serrated edges designed to cut through the membranes. Other children used an ordinary teaspoon and quickly discovered why the special tool existed. The first attempt might release a neat section. The second could send juice across the plate onto the table or toward a clean school shirt. Grapefruit was not a breakfast that encouraged speed. It required cutting, scooping, and enough patience to remove the fruit without excavating half the rind. Adults often saw freshness and good sense. Children sometimes saw a small bowl with walls built around every bite. Preparing grapefruit usually began before it reached the child. An adult sliced the fruit across the middle, then worked a knife around the outer edge and between the sections so the spoon could lift each piece more easily. This advanced work made the finished plate look effortless, although the juice on the cutting board told another story. Some families cut the sections only loosely, leaving the child to finish the job. Others prepared the fruit so carefully that each spoonful rose almost intact. Sugar was added according to taste and household rules. A light dusting could take the edge off the bitterness. A generous layer dissolved into the juice at the bottom, creating a sweet reward after the final section had been removed. Children who dislike the fruit sometimes ate only the sugared surface, then rearranged the remaining sections to suggest progress. Grapefruit required close inspection, and breakfast tables were not always short of inspectors. The fruit carried an image of freshness and adult respectability that contrasted sharply with sweetened cereal or donuts. It appeared in magazine photographs, hotel breakfast diners and home kitchens, where a fruit course made the morning seem properly organized. Yet its presence varied widely. Climate, regional distribution, household income season, and family preference all shaped whether grapefruit appeared regularly or only occasionally. Families in citrus-growing regions might encounter it more easily. Others bought it when prices were favorable, or when the grocery store displayed a particularly attractive shipment. Some children remember grapefruit as a dependable winter breakfast. Others recall it mainly from visits to grandparents, or from mornings when a parent had decided the family should eat something fresh. It could be served alone, but more often it stood beside toast, eggs, cereal, or another food substantial enough to complete the meal. Half a grapefruit looked generous on a plate. Its actual ability to satisfy a hungry older child was open to debate. Texture made the breakfast as memorable as flavor. The flesh could be cool and firm while the thin membranes resisted the spoon. One section came free beautifully. The next collapsed into juice and pulp. Seeds had to be removed in some varieties, and a child who bit down on one remembered it immediately. The bitter white pith remained around the edges, waiting for anyone who scraped too enthusiastically. When the sections were gone, the rind held a shallow pool of sweetened juice. Some children tipped the half toward the spoon and drank it carefully. Others lifted the rind directly, an action that promised efficiency, but frequently sent juice toward the chin. Grapefruit demanded a napkin, a steady hand, and several uninterrupted minutes. It was an elegant breakfast only from a distance. Orange juice offered fruit in a form more compatible with the school clock. Behind the freezer door sat a small cylindrical can of frozen concentrate, cold enough to collect frost around its paper label and metal ends. The can was opened at both ends or at one end, depending on the kitchen tool and the person preparing it. Inside was a dense orange cylinder, brighter and more intense than the finished drink. The concentrate slid or was spooned into a pitcher, followed by several cans of water measured using the empty container. A long spoon stirred through the mixture until the frozen mass dissolved. At first, the pitcher held streaks of dark orange and pale water moving separately. Then the colour evened out, the last icy lump disappeared, and breakfast juice was ready for several glasses at once. Frozen concentrate suited family life because one compact can could become a full pitcher without requiring fresh oranges, squeezing equipment, or much refrigerator space before preparation. The product also allowed families to keep juice available in the freezer until it was needed, though small freezer compartments could already be crowded with metal ice trays, frozen vegetables, meat packages, and carefully wrapped leftovers. Once mixed, the juice had to be stored in the refrigerator and stirred again if the contents settled. The person preparing it could make the flavour stronger or weaker by changing the amount of water intentionally or otherwise. A hurried child might receive a glass that tasted bright and concentrated. The next pitcher could seem thin enough to raise questions. Measuring with the empty can was simple, but it still required someone to count while the kitchen filled with distractions. The can opener added another recognizable sound to the morning. Metal teeth pressed into the lid, the handle turned, and the top came free with a sharp edge that children were warned not to touch. Some cans used pull tabs only in later packaging. So many families depended on a manual opener and a spoon to release the frozen contents. The concentrate sometimes refused to leave cleanly. Warm water run briefly over the outside helped loosen it, or the spoon scraped around the cylinder until it dropped suddenly into the pitcher. A small piece could remain attached inside the can, too valuable to rinse away, and too cold to remove gracefully. The preparation was still faster than squeezing enough fresh oranges for a family, but convenience had its own small rituals. The can had to be opened, emptied, measured, stirred, and discarded, while the sticky spoon and pitcher waited beside the sink. Together, grapefruit and frozen orange juice showed two different directions in the changing breakfast. The grapefruit asked the child to slow down and work through the fruit section by section. The concentrate allowed several servings to appear from one frozen package in only a few minutes. One breakfast emphasized the whole fruit, its bitterness, membranes, and seeds. The other turned citrus into a standardized drink that could wait behind the freezer door. Neither belonged to every household, and neither erased the other. Both could sit on the same formica table beside toast eggs or cereal, representing a decade in which older breakfast customs and new convenience products shared the morning. The next step would remove even the spoon and the fruit knife. Chocolate powder would fall into a glass of milk, and a package would claim that breakfast itself could be stirred, swallowed, and finished before the bus reached the corner. The powder fell into the glass in a soft brown heap, landing on cold milk before the spoon began its work. On a 1960s school morning, Carnation Instant Breakfast offered a startlingly modern proposition. Breakfast did not always need a plate. It could be measured from a packet or canister stirred into a drinking glass and swallowed while the rest of the household continued moving. The chocolate version attracted children most easily because it looked familiar enough to resemble chocolate milk, even though the package presented it as something more substantial. At first, the dry powder floated in small islands across the surface. Then the spoon struck the sides of the glass with quick metallic taps, pulling the mixture downward until the milk darkened. A few stubborn clumps remained near the bottom or attached themselves above the milk line. The drink might be stirred for another 10 seconds, but the school clock had already made its opinion clear. Breakfast was ready enough. The attraction was not difficult to understand. A child who resisted oatmeal eggs or grapefruit might accept a chocolate drink without a long negotiation. There was no skillet smell, no changing texture, and no yolk requiring a decision about softness. The glass appeared cold, sweet, and predictable. Vanilla and other flavors could be found, but chocolate offered the strongest disguise for the idea that a prepared powder could stand in for a morning meal. The first swallow was smooth when the mixture had been stirred thoroughly. A poorly mixed glass delivered a different experience: thin chocolate milk at the top, stronger sweetness near the bottom, and a final mouthful containing enough powder to remind the child that someone had stopped stirring too soon. Some children deliberately saved the darker layer. Others viewed it as a household failure. The spoon usually remained inside the glass so breakfast could be stirred again halfway through, creating one more small obstacle when someone tried to drink too quickly. The product fit neatly into the growing 1960s language of convenience. Food companies were increasingly promising that packaged products could shorten household work without abandoning the appearance of care. Instant breakfast did not ask a parent to crack fry toast or bake anything. It required milk, a glass, a spoon, and access to the package. An older child could prepare it alone. A parent leaving early for work could place the ingredients on the counter. A family with several children could mix one serving after another without covering the stove in pans. Yet the labour had not disappeared entirely. Someone still had to buy the milk, keep it cold, wash the glasses, wipe spilled powder from the counter, and remember that the container was nearly empty. Convenience often removed the visible middle of a task while leaving its beginning and end exactly where they had always been. Advertising presented the drink as an answer to mornings when children had no appetite or no time. That idea matched a real household problem. Some children woke hungry. Others could not imagine eating until they had been awake for an hour, by which point they were already expected to be sitting in a classroom. Parents worried when breakfast remained untouched, particularly if lunch was still several hours away. A drink could pass more easily than a full plate. It could be consumed at the table, beside the sink, or while standing near the door with one arm already inside a coat sleeve. The package offered reassurance that the glass represented more than ordinary flavoured milk, although families interpreted those promises according to their own habits. Some used it as the entire breakfast. Others served it beside toast fruit or a donut. In many homes it remained an occasional solution for the child who was late sleepy, difficult to feed, or suddenly certain that chewing had become impossible before 8 in the morning. The mixture had its own recognisable mess. Fine powder escaped whenever the spoon entered the container too quickly. It settled around the rim, dusted the counter, and formed dark spots when it met a drop of milk. Packets reduced the measuring but created torn paper corners and the question of whether every last bit had been shaken into the glass. A child preparing the drink alone might add the powder first, and pour the milk too rapidly, sending a brown cloud upward. Another filled the glass so close to the top that stirring became impossible without creating a small chocolate tide across the counter. The correct method seemed obvious only after it had been done incorrectly several times. Leave room stir from the bottom, and do not assume that speed and accuracy are the same thing. The product was instant. The child was still learning. For parents, the drink could represent both relief and uncertainty. It solved the immediate problem of getting something into a child before school, but it also challenged older ideas about what breakfast ought to look like. A proper morning meal had traditionally involved a bowl, a plate, or at least toast held in the hand. Drinking breakfast made the meal seem temporary, almost as though it were passing through the kitchen rather than belonging there. Some adults embraced the shortcut because schedules were changing and the practical value was obvious. Others treated it as a backup, useful but not quite equal to egg cereal or hot oatmeal. The child rarely shared that philosophical concern. Chocolate before school was easy to defend, particularly when the package itself claimed respectability. The negotiation had shifted. Instead of persuading the child to eat breakfast, the parent was now deciding whether drinking it counted. The glass also reflected broader changes inside American homes. More mothers were balancing household labour with paid employment. Children's activities and school schedules created tighter mornings. Supermarkets offered a growing number of products designed for specific moments of difficulty: the rushed supper, the unfinished lunchbox, the child who would not eat the parent who had only minutes left. Instant breakfast belonged to that expanding shelf of solutions. It did not replace the family breakfast table, but it made sitting at that table less necessary. A child could drink while standing, carry the glass from room to room, despite instructions not to, and finish near the door. The meal had become quicker, more individual, and less connected to the stove. Even the flavour was selected one serving at a time rather than prepared for everyone in one pan. When the glass was empty, a thin chocolate coating remained around the bottom, and a few dark drops marked the counter where the spoon had rested. The child rinsed the glass if reminded, left it beside the sink if not, and hurried toward the bus with breakfast completed almost entirely through swallowing. The product's promise was larger than convenience. It suggested that the morning meal could be compressed without disappearing, that a package could supply reassurance when time could not. For some families that was useful. For some children it was delicious. For others it was merely faster than arguing over eggs. The final breakfast in this story would carry the same idea even farther. It would leave the glass behind seal fruit filling inside pastry wrap, each piece in foil, and turn the toaster into a departure gate for a meal that no longer needed the table at all. The foil wrapper opened with a dry metallic crackle, revealing 2 flat pastries pressed into neat rectangles. On a 1960s school morning, Pop-Tarts looked less like something prepared in a kitchen than something engineered to pass through one. Each pastry held a thin layer of fruit filling between sheets of crust with small holes across the top to release steam. It could be eaten straight from the package, but the toaster completed the promise. The pastry slid into the slot. The lever went down and breakfast disappeared for a minute behind glowing coils. No mixing bowl waited on the counter. No skillet needed butter. No spoon struck the side of a cereal bowl. When the toaster released its passenger with a sudden pop, a child had a warm breakfast that could be lifted by one corner and carried toward the door. The meal had not merely become faster, it had become portable. Kellogg introduced Pop-Tarts in 1964 with 4 original varieties: strawberry, blueberry, brown sugar, cinnamon, and apple currant. The earliest pastries were unfrosted, which made practical sense for a product intended to survive toaster heat packaging, shipping, and a child's school morning grip. The fruit filling stayed enclosed at least under normal conditions, and the crust protected fingers from most of the stickiness inside. The first bite broke through a dry, crumbly edge before reaching the sweeter center. Toasted too lightly, the pastry remained cool in the middle. Toasted too long, the filling became far hotter than the calm outer crust suggested. Many children learned that lesson by biting immediately into what appeared to be a harmless rectangle. The outside said breakfast. The inside had become a small fruit-flavored furnace. The toaster itself introduced several household rules. The pastry was supposed to stand upright inside the slot rather than bend or become trapped below the lifting mechanism. Children were warned not to insert a fork or knife when something became stuck, a warning delivered with unusual seriousness compared with ordinary breakfast instructions. The heating setting mattered. A level suitable for bread could darken the pastry's edges, while repeated cycles could make the filling dangerously hot. Some parents handled the toaster themselves. Older children were allowed to operate it after proving they could wait for the mechanism rather than investigate it. Others ate the pastries unheated because the school bus was already visible, the toaster was occupied, or no adult wanted another appliance-related discussion before 8 o'clock. Pop-Tarts could adapt. Warm or cold, seated or standing, they remained recognizable. Their greatest advantage was not flavor alone, but independence. A child could open the package, place a pastry in the toaster, and complete breakfast with little supervision. One pastry could be heated without preparing the same meal for everyone else. A younger child might eat strawberry while an older sibling chose brown sugar cinnamon. Breakfast no longer had to emerge from one shared saucepan or skillet. It could be selected individually from a box and prepared according to each child's schedule. That flexibility suited households in which parents left for work at different times, several children attended different schools, or the morning had simply become too crowded for everyone to sit together. The package offered consistency. The pastry would be the same shape tomorrow, require the same amount of work, and produce roughly the same result unless the toaster became ambitious. Portability completed the change. A cereal bowl belonged to the table. Oatmeal demanded a chair. Sausage gravy required a plate and fork. Even a donut left powdered evidence across a clean shirt. A toaster pastry could be held in one hand while the other managed a lunchbox, coat notebook, or front door. A child could eat it in the kitchen, on the porch in the family car, or while walking toward the bus stop. Crumbs still fell and the filling could escape from a cracked corner, but the meal no longer insisted on remaining in one room. This was convenient for families, yet it also weakened the old expectation that breakfast should gather everyone around the same table. The pastry did not create the hurried American morning by itself. It simply fit that morning so well that the hurry began to feel normal. That distinction matters because not every child had breakfast waiting at home, packaged or otherwise. Some families lacked money, time, reliable transportation to a supermarket, or an adult available during the morning rush. Some children left before they felt hungry, and arrived at school wishing they had eaten. In 1966, the federal school breakfast program began as a pilot effort, recognizing that the question of whether children ate before class could not always be solved inside the family kitchen. The program did not immediately reach every school, and home breakfast remained widely varied, but its creation revealed the deeper issue beneath the cheerful packages and advertisements. Breakfast could be nostalgic, comforting, and even funny in memory. It could also depend on household income geography, parental work, and whether enough food remained before the next grocery trip. Looking back across these 25 breakfasts, the 1960s school morning seems crowded with competing ideas. Cornflakes promised speed. Banana slices made the bowl more filling. Oatmeal and farina carried warmth from the saucepan. Toast stretched bread through jelly, cinnamon, peanut butter, eggs, and gravy. Pancakes and waffles made weekdays feel special, while frozen waffles moved the work into a cardboard box. Biscuits, grits, cornmeal mush, and chipped beef carried regional and family traditions that no national advertisement could fully represent. Donuts and refrigerated rolls negotiated between pleasure and respectability. Grapefruit required patience. Frozen orange juice concentrated fruit into a can. Instant breakfast turned the meal into a drink. Pop-Tarts completed the progression by giving breakfast edges firm enough to leave the house. None of these foods belonged to every child, and many never truly vanished. Some moved to weekends, some changed packaging or preparation. Others remained strongest in particular regions, communities, and family recipe boxes. What disappeared most clearly was not always the food itself, but the arrangement around it. The newspaper beside the cereal bowl, the saucepan soaking near the sink, the parent cutting toast into triangles, and the brief expectation that breakfast happened before anyone crossed the doorway. The labour behind those mornings deserves as much memory as the flavours. Someone checked the milk, saved the bacon, grease stretched the flour, divided the last banana, and watched the wall clock while making sure the children left with something inside them. By the time the foil wrapper crackled and the toaster lever dropped, breakfast was learning how to travel. The school bus was already at the corner, and the American morning was leaving the table with it.